So I just thought, I've been obviously presenting these pretty much every year for the last 5 years that I've been here. And I just thought I'd do something different today, mainly because it's of interest to me. And I don't know much about, well, I didn't know much about Greek mythology. I probably still don't, but I did read up on it, preparing for this lecture. And I just really wanted to know why the Achilles was called the Achilles. And obviously the reason is obvious, but a bit more about it. Yeah, so I thought I'm not going to talk about my research today. What I'll talk about is really just some interesting things about the Achilles tendon. So that's really what I'm going to sort of focus on. Some things that I find interesting about the Achilles tendon. So I thought, and I'm going to try and relate these somehow to Achilles the Warrior. So we'll see how we go in terms of relating these to Achilles the Warrior. So I thought I'd start with just a bit of a quick poll. So use the hand function in your, let me just see if I can see everybody here. Use the hand function to answer this question. Did Achilles the Warrior exist? So was he a real person? If you think yes, please put up your hand function now. If you think yes, and we'll do a quick poll. Okay, good. I've got, give you another minute or so. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 out of 15. So 7 out of 15, so almost 50%. That's split right down the middle in terms of people who think Achilles was real or not. And the motivation for that question really did come partly from my ignorance about what the answer was. So it's interesting to see how the people are split there in terms of answering that question. But the truth is, probably partly everybody is right, because it's not really known whether Achilles was someone who actually lived and did all the heroic things that he's said to do, or whether he was just a character in the poem, the Iliad, written by Homer. So that was interesting. I didn't realize that myself when I was sort of researching this, but I think the consensus, and this is mainly from Google sources, so take this with a pinch of salt, but I think the consensus is that he probably is based on someone that is real, if not a single person, possibly a number of people who contributed and did some of the things that he's said to have done. And then Homer wrote about all these heroic acts in the years to come, and I think it was 200 or 300 years afterwards. But I'm absolutely sure there are people in the audience who know much more about Greek mythology than me. So please feel free to correct me as I go through this. But that's sort of what I found out. So that was interesting. So possibly real, possibly part fiction. But I guess probably the most interesting thing about Achilles is that he was mortal, but he had the good fortune of his mother, when he was a baby, dipping him in the river Styx. And the river Styx was part of the sort of Greek mythological underworld, and it conferred special powers, and that was that he wasn't vulnerable, or he was not able to be well, I guess, yeah, the best way of saying it, he wasn't vulnerable in any part of his body, aside from the part that his mother, Thetis, was holding when she dipped him in the river Styx, and that was his Achilles tendon. So she was holding his Achilles tendon, and the story goes that because she was holding it so tightly, that part of his body wasn't dipped in the river Styx, so he was vulnerable only at this point. So that, of course, is where the name Achilles tendon comes from. So it's basically just the association between the part of the body that fetus was holding at the time, his Achilles tendon, and that anatomical part of the body that has taken the name of Achilles the Warrior. So that is where his name came from. So we'll talk more about his invulnerability as we go through and try and sort of relate some of the interesting bits about the Achilles. But what I want to start with is what Achilles is probably best known as, and that is obviously a real heroic soldier of the Trojan War. So the Trojan War is written about by Homer in Iliad, and it basically is a war that went for 10 years between the Trojan people, who basically sort of Troy was part of what is now Turkey, and the Greek people. So it went on for 10 years, and Achilles is the main protagonist of the Iliad, and does all these wonderful things within the Iliad. But the one that probably sticks out, the one that I just want to mention in terms of an example of his heroism, is when he slayed his enemy Hector. So Hector was a very sort of, high-ranking warrior in the Troy army, and Achilles basically is best known for defeating him in a battle that they had together. So I think this demonstrates that, and that ultimately led to the Greek people defeating the Trojans in the war. So I think this indicates how special Achilles is or was. And I want to start with just talking about some facts about the Achilles tendon, and indicating, and the parallel here is the Achilles tendon is different to other tendons, which is one of the reasons why I'm interested in it. So, so this is where we start talking about the actual tendon. So energy storage, one of the things with the Achilles tendon is that it's an energy storage tendon. So what that means is that it is able to act like a spring when we're doing human functions like walking and running. And not many tendons have the ability to do this. And in fact, you could probably say that no tendons, aside from the Achilles tendon, can really do it to the extent that the Achilles can. So it is separated in that function. It has the best ability to act like a spring. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why in a second. There's a group from University College London, headed up by Professor Helen Birch, and they've been looking at and interested in the differences between tendons for many, many years now. And they've come up with some really some studies that have delineated what is special about the Achilles and other energy storage tendons. So they take a lot of high forces when we're doing functional activities, and that's related to the fact that they do stretch like a spring. So they undergo a lot of loading. They're relatively compliant. So the structure of tendons varies, and so does the material properties, as we'll talk more about. The Achilles is a relatively compliant tendon, and this allows it to really act like a spring and take that and really sort of capitalize on that energy storage function. It also has a high proportion of glycosaminoglycans. So these are glycosaminoglycans are basically proteins. And they're the proteins that bind water. So you've probably heard of them through cartilage. So we know that cartilage is packed with glycosaminoglycans, and that's what gives it its compressive strength. So you do have some of these within tendon as well. And the really interesting thing is that you have more of these proteins binding water in tendons that are energy storage tendons, as opposed to the other type of tendon, which I'll tell you about in a second. Energy storage tendons also have really high strains. So what that means is that they do stretch really. See if I can find elastic to demonstrate, but they do have a huge amount of stretch when you put load onto them. So they undergo high levels of strain or stretch when you load them. So much like an elastic band or this TheraBand here, they sort of undergo this real huge change in their length, and it could be up to 10% elongation within the Achilles tendon. And that happens during functions like hopping or like running and jumping, which we'll talk about. So they're the features of energy storage tendons, and particularly the Achilles, because that's the best energy storage tendon or the best example. You've also got positional tendons. So these are tendons that are there just to transfer load. So all they do is basically act to transfer the load between the muscle and the bone to allow you to move. So there's countless examples of these all around the body. They probably dominate in terms of counts when you compare them to energy storage tendons, particularly since I've just told you that Achilles is the only true energy storage tendon. But these tendons are stiffer. They have lower glycosaminoglycans. They are not at risk of injury. You hardly ever get injuries, if ever, in these tendons. So an example would be something like the tendons connecting your lat dorsi to your spine, for example. Those are small tendons. They're short. They don't have a function in energy storage like the Achilles does. So hopefully what you've got from this is that tendons are different, and there are different types of tendons, and that does determine their risk of injury. So like Achilles the Warrior, Achilles is special in terms of its function. The thing that I think helps people to understand this point a bit more is thinking about what happens during functions like walking and stretching. So if you think about walking, it's a relatively fast cyclical activity, and during walking, your muscle tendon unit undergoes quite a fast stretch. So the whole unit is under load, particularly as you go towards this mid-stance position. So you're going to be more lengthened. If you take a point from, say, the calcaneum to the back of the knee, it's going to be longer than when you're out of mid-stance position, say, during push-off. So we know that the muscle tendon unit is under some load, and it's also getting stretched. But the interesting thing is that stretch doesn't occur in the tendon. It occurs in the muscle. Sorry, vice versa. That stretch doesn't occur in the muscle, it occurs in the tendon. So the part that actually stretches is the tendon. So the tendon undergoes this stretch. And that's during functions that involve some speed. And that is facilitated by a really fast contraction of the muscle. So you have to have a muscle that is very fast and very powerful to be able to support the tendon, because the tendon's quite stiff. Even though the Achilles is more compliant than other tendons, still quite stiff. So you need to have a relatively strong muscle to be able to maximize that potential for the tendon to act like a spring. And it will happen during activities like walking. And that's in contrast to activities like stretching. So if someone did a stretch like this, what would tend to happen is a lot of the stretch will happen in the muscle component as opposed to the tendon component. So we can think about the muscle and tendon as two springs in series, and the stiffness of each spring will depend on the activity. So if you do something that's relatively passive, like stretching, the spring that is less stiff and stretches is the muscle. If you do something that is relatively active and involves speed, like walking, the spring that is less stiff is the tendon, because the muscle is contracting strongly. So that sort of is a key factor which delineates tendon function, i.e. during passive or slow activities and fast activities, and really brings about this mechanism of stretching within the tendon. And that's really the basis of the stretch shorten cycle. So it pretty much is exactly what we have just gone through, and that is that when you're doing something that is ballistic or fast or involving some speed like walking or running or jumping, the tendon is a less stiff spring, and the muscle is contracting really, really hard and fast, and therefore it's going to allow the tendon to store energy and act like a spring. So that mechanism is what we call the stretch-shorten cycle. It happens within the stretch-shorten cycle. So anything that involves fast activity, like running, hopping, and jumping, is really where the tendon is able to store energy. The Achilles tendon does contribute to locomotion, as we'll see in a second. So I just want to talk briefly about how it does this, because this is really interesting as well. So it does this by, firstly, its microstructure. So you've got this really intricate structure, and people would have seen this diagram for sure, when you've been studying anatomy or various things, but the key things to remember are fibril, fiber, and fascicle. So they're the three subunits of the tendon. So the fibril aggregates to make fibers and then to make fascicles. So that's how the tendon is organized. And what you get, and this is relatively new sort of understanding, is that you have sliding. So it hasn't really been known for a long time, and it still isn't completely known where the tendon actually stretches when you get a stretch-shorten cycle. So where do you get this 10%, which is quite big strain in the tendon, in the Achilles? Where does that actually occur? It's still an open question, but people are starting to answer it. And one of the key current answers is that it may occur in what is called the interfascicular matrix. So in between the fascicles, you have this space, and it's a matrix of connective tissue that's a little bit more stretchy. It has some elastin. It has a lot of brown substance, and it sort of is able to stretch a lot more. So some groups around the world, this is actually from Queen Mary University where I used to work. There's a really, really good lab scientist there who does a lot of work in this area. And what they have discovered is that if you look at these tendons, these positional versus energy storage tendons, they have structural differences. So the fascicles are on an angle for energy storage tendons, on a greater angle. And when you stretch them, so when you apply tensile load to the fascicles, they slide. They're more able to slide. And they also undergo rotation because they're angled. And we'll see that with the Achilles tendon. And people would probably know from anatomy the Achilles tendon is twisted. So it has this twisting, which also facilitates energy storage. So this is one of the mechanisms that allows tendons to actually store energy. And it doesn't happen in positional tendons. So most of the other tendons, aside from the Achilles, it doesn't really happen. If we go one level up from the micro level to the muscle tendon unit level, you also see that the structure of the muscle tendon unit is facilitates energy storage. So you have this tendon, the Achilles tendon, that's really long. So it's probably the longest tendon in the body. And so because it's long, and given that's long, it's going to be more compliant. But you have this really long tendon, and then you have this soleus and gastroc muscle portion that have got really short and very oblique fascicles. So you can see the fascicles of the muscle are on a huge angle and very oblique. So what we know about muscle physiology is that the physiological cross-sectional area is key for determining how much force the muscle can produce. And the more oblique the fascicles, the more physiological cross-sectional area and the more force a muscle can produce. So the soleus muscle and the gastroc, but particularly the soleus, has got a lot of capacity to produce force and high amounts of force, but it doesn't have capacity to undergo large changes in the fascicle length. And that's because the fascicles are really tiny and they're really short. So it doesn't have the capacity to change fascicle length. If you think about the metabolic cost of movement, of human movement, it really does come down to the fascicles, and it comes down to how much they move and also how fast they move. So if you can reduce the speed and the magnitude of movement in fascicles, then your human movement is much more efficient. And that's pretty much exactly what the Achilles does. So the Achilles, by energy storage and taking energy during human movement, it then is able to allow the fascicles that are part of the muscle not to move or contract as much. So they undergo much less excursion, and most of the movement occurs, or most of the change in length occurs in the tendon, which is a real unique, really unique feature of this muscle tendon unit, the Achilles tendon. So we can contrast that to the hamstring. So we know the hamstring undergoes lots of, or is prone to injury. So we know it's the #1 injury in football, muscle strains in the hamstring. And if you look at the architecture and the structure of the hamstring, it's very different. So there's long fascicles, really long fascicles, very short free tendon. Okay, there's obviously an intramuscular tendon that goes all the way through the hamstring, as you can see here, but the free tendon is very short, and therefore it's not able to store energy. And most of the excursion and the change in length occurs at the actual muscle level when you're contracting the hamstring. That's definitely one of the reasons why the hamstring is susceptible to muscle strain injury. And you might be thinking you do get calf injuries, and definitely you do. But if you think about calf injuries, they tend to happen later on when you're older, and that possibly is related to change in the properties of the Achilles and the ability of the Achilles to act like a spring, which I'll talk about in a second. So there are differences in the structural level. So if we think about what those differences actually mean, this is some modelling work, and this is actually an Australian group, partly out of Melbourne Uni. What they did here was look at the muscle tendon unit length, and that is of the gastrocnemius and the soleus. And they also looked at the muscle fiber length of each of those muscles and the tendon length. This is during running at different speeds. So what they found, so going right from 2.1 meters per second right up to pretty fast running of 8 meters per second, or 9 meters per second. What they found is that you do get, as you would imagine, in the mid-stance position, a lengthening of the muscle tendon unit. So the muscle tendon unit is longer. You do get a stretching of the tendon in that position as well. You can see here the length of the tendon increases. And this is going up to about sort of 7 or 8% strain, as we talked about earlier. But what you don't get is an increase in the length of the fascicle, or probably more correctly, not as great an increase in the length of the fascicle. So the fascicle length is fairly constant, and particularly when you're running at faster speeds. So running at faster speeds will then bring in a stronger muscle contraction, and the tendon then takes over and starts to store energy and change length. Okay, so that's an example of what we were talking about earlier with the ability of the Achilles tendon to improve the efficiency of human movement and act like a spring passively to contribute to locomotion. And that really is a very, very unique mechanism. Probably doesn't happen as well as I've sort of said anywhere else in the body. So in order to support this sort of stretch, shorten cycle, you also need really strong muscle contraction. So So within the stretch shorten cycle, you also have very strong and rapid muscle contraction, especially when you're starting to push off. So the initial phase is when you're going into a counter movement, and that's where it needs to be fast because you need to activate the stretch reflex. So if you do that counter movement in a way that is fast enough, you'll activate the stretch reflex, and that will potentiate the muscle contraction when you go from the eccentric to the concentric phase of the stretch shorten cycle. So part of it is active and reflex, and then the other part of it is passive. So you've also got in that stretching part, you've got the tendon spring that is going to stretch very rapidly, store the energy, and then release that energy as you're ready to jump or run or come off the ground, whatever the case may be. So I guess the important thing from a rehabilitation point of view is to realize that we do need to focus on the tendon, and the tendon health and tendon function is critical as part of this process. But we also need to appreciate that a big, strong part of the stretch shorten cycle, and something that really drives the stretch shorten cycle, is the muscle contraction. So really thinking about ways that we can maximize muscle output, motor unit recruitment and firing, and also making sure that is rapid is an essential part of recovering function in the Achilles tendon. So I think I've demonstrated there with some of those slides that the Achilles is a unique tendon. It's got unique functions, energy storage, and it really does contribute to the economy of human movement in this way. What I want to move on to now is talking about another feature of Achilles the Warrior, and that was that he was apparently supremely handsome and charismatic. So that is sort of depicted quite well by Brad Pitt in the movie Troy not long ago. So I do think there are parallels here with the Achilles tendon as well. And probably the most obvious one is just the fact that the microstructure is so well organized and really just, I guess, something also of a lot of beauty. And we've talked about the sort of fibril, the fiber, and the fascicle level. I guess what we are starting to learn more about is also the subtendon. So this is what I want to talk about here a little bit. So we do have three muscles, the lateral gastroc, the medial gastroc, and the soleus, and they all contribute to the Achilles tendon. What we're starting to understand is that they have probably quite distinct and different functions within the Achilles tendon. So they don't function as just this huge, big, massive tendon that just stretches in unison. They probably function quite differently within that Achilles tendon. So this is something that sort of people are starting to appreciate more and more. And the subtendon unit is probably, or definitely is, higher than the tendon unit. So if we look at this, this is an electron microscope cross-section of a tendon. And what you can see here, and I think this is where the real sort of beauty of the Achilles tendon comes to light, but you can see the fibers, and you can also see the fascicles and the connective tissue around the fascicles. So when you're thinking about subtendon, so you're thinking about the gastroc and the soleus parts of the Achilles tendon, it's going to be a collection of these fascicles put together. So you put a collection of those fascicles together, and they will have a function that is different to the rest of the tendon. So that's facilitated by sliding between these subtendon levels. And this is something that we're sort of starting to understand a little bit more just recently. A lot of it comes from modeling studies, and This is one of them. So if you look at this one, what they were interested in here is more so the twisting structure. So I mentioned how the Achilles twists from origin to insertion. So if you think about the muscle tendon junction proximally, and then you go down to the distal insertion into the calcaneum, there's a rotation of the Achilles tendon. So if you look here, and the reason why there's three different depictions here is because it's quite variable between people. So one of the things we're also learning is that Achilles structure is so intricate and so individual as well. So there are different types of Achilles orientations and organizations for different people. And some of those might have implications for pathology as well. But generally, the soleus here at the top is sort of deeper, I guess you could say, which makes sense because that's where the soleus muscle is. And then as you go down to the distal part of the tendon, it actually goes medial. So the soleus is on the medial part of your Achilles tendon as it goes down into the calcaneum. So that's fascinating. It's really improving our understanding of the Achilles tendon and how it really doesn't act as just one big lump of tendon. The other types of studies that people are doing in this area is imaging studies, and particularly speckle tracking. So this is really high-end ultrasound work where you put an ultrasound probe on the tendon and you basically track the speckles within that ultrasound image via an algorithm. And you can see with different contractions and different sort of images that there's not a uniform strain or displacement in the tendon. The deeper part of the tendon, possibly the part related to the soleus, has a greater displacement than other parts of the tendon. So there are quite a few people who have looked at this type of work and are finding similar things. So that's really indicating that there are different subunits and they don't all act together. And the importance of that is that we sort of have this really complex Achilles tendon and muscle tendon unit that we really don't understand. And the rehab we do is probably so simplistic and not able to anywhere near match the complexity of what the tendon and muscle are doing. So it's just realizing that and trying to work towards a better understanding of how these elements of the tendon actually work, I think is where things are going to go in the future. We do know that it isn't all good. This is one of the differences with Achilles the Warrior that I want to bring up now, because we know that as you get older, the Achilles tendon doesn't cope so well as with a lot of other musculoskeletal tissues. And you do get a change in the ability of the tendon to act in this non-uniform way. So it does go downhill. You don't have that intricate function, and that probably is contributing to pathology, contributing to functional reductions in the ability to actually use it as a spring. So so that is something that is also emerging. And that is in contrast to Achilles the Warrior, who died on the Trojan battlefield when he was very young and still very beautiful and functioning well. Aside from after he died, obviously. So that's one of the differences between the warrior and the Achilles tendon. So looking a little bit further at these differences in the subunit function, probably the latest paper and one of the most interesting ones I've read was talking about how it probably does have, it's probably very much more individual than what we originally thought. So different people in the future, we might be able to profile different structures of these subunits, and that might even be a strong risk factor for injury because there's so much sliding between these subunits. It may be one of the reasons this sort of concentration of frictional stress between them could actually contribute to some of the injury that we see. So that is that's an interesting sort of area as well in terms of how the tendon functions. All right, so moving on then, the next point about Achilles the Warrior that I want to bring up is the fact that he was a very, very loyal soldier. He was from all accounts, he was a real team player, and he was loyal to his friends, very, very loyal to his friends, and really contributed as a team member. So in the Trojan War. So basically, I think we can liken this to the Achilles tendon in terms of how much work it does during, and we've probably touched on some of this already, but how much work and how much it contributes to walking and running. This is an example of just pure force in the tendon and how much force it actually takes. So you can see here that in running, the forces, if you're running at 2.8 meters per second, the force in your Achilles tendon could be as high as 3.3 times your body weight. So you're looking at, 300 kilos of force going through the Achilles tendon. And that's probably an underestimate because it does depend also on the methods that people use. Other methods have shown higher levels of force. Walking probably is lower than that. So it certainly does, it's exposed to all the ground reaction force and all the loads going up the limb. So I think in that way, it is a team player. It takes all the load that then ends up finding its way up into the proximal part of your leg. It also contributes to performance. And I wanted to just touch on the concept of stiffness before I go into this. But if you think about stiffness, it's obviously a term that's used really commonly, but it can be a very confusing term as well for people who haven't come across it. You can measure the stiffness of any material. So I can measure the stiffness of this TheraBand, and it's just the amount of displacement for a given force. Okay, so if I've got it really bundled up like that, it's going to be very stiff. But if I make it thinner, it's going to be, for the same force, much more stretchy. So, so stiffness is just the amount of displacement for a given force, and it's given by this gradient of the force by displacement curve. So, and that's really talking about, when people talk about stiffness, they talk about the actual, not the material properties, but the structural properties of the tendon. Whereas when people talk about modulus, they're talking about the material properties. So this is when you divide the force by the cross-sectional area. So you're sort of factoring it by how big the tendon is, and you're also then dividing the elongation by the length of the tendon, because the structural properties will affect those properties, force and extension. So therefore you can then compare tendons of different size, and that's why people do that. So that's the modulus. Okay, so those two terms you'll probably see, but they're important to understand the next slide, which is how Achilles contributes to performance. So we know that if you're a really good sprinter, you probably have a very stiff Achilles tendon. And that is because when you're sort of in the contact phase, you're going to be having a huge amount of muscle contraction that's going to stretch the Achilles tendon. Even though it's so stiff, it's going to stretch it, it's going to store huge amounts of energy that are going to contribute to power in sprinting. And the same for a marathon runner, but slightly different. It will also contribute to performance for a marathon runner, but in a different way. It's actually probably better to have a less stiff Achilles if you're a marathon runner, if you compare it to your peers, i.e. other marathon runners. So marathon runners that are trained will have a stiffer tendon than an untrained person, that's for sure. But if you are a marathon runner, it's probably better to have a less stiff tendon, because you're going to be more efficient at storing energy, and possibly that relates to another concept called hysteresis, which is loss of energy during a stretch shortened cycle. stretching of the tendon. So it's how much energy is lost or dissipated in the tendon. So the better you are at returning that energy, the better metabolism, and that's obviously going to have advantages for a marathon. So Achilles is definitely a team player. It does contribute to performance. Probably the last point that I'm going to go into is probably not a positive point for Achilles the Warrior. He had a very bad temper. He was very easy to anger. He had vitriolic rages, and probably the best example and the most graphic example of this was when he killed Hector, his arch enemy, and instead of returning Hector's body to the Trojans for a sort of proper burial, he mutilated the body and displayed it. So that just is an example of his temper. But on a positive note, he was able to, with sort of consultation with various sort of leaders in the Greek army, he actually reneged on that and eventually did give Hector's body back for a decent burial, proper burial. And that shows his ability to adapt and his ability for personal growth. So I'm now going to talk about tendon adaptation. So in terms of adaptation, probably the most important concept here is mechanotransduction. And this is not special to the Achilles tendon. It happens in all load-bearing tissues that are load sensing. So basically you have cells in the tendon which are all fibroblasts but specialized for different tendons. In the tendon, they're called tenocytes. And these cells are stuck together in lines. And what happens is when you have, you have this structure around them where there's proteins that form what is called a cytoskeleton. And that is basically like a protein, structural proteins that form pretty much like a framework that is able to mechanically transfer load that is on the matrix into the tendon cell. And then the tendon responds. So you've got connections, physical protein connections between the extracellular matrix and the cell, and they then transfer the loads from the matrix to the cell. The cell, of course, is also deformed. So you get compression, you get stretching of the cell, you get shearing of the cell. So the cell itself has mechanisms for sensing and then distributing load between cells, so from one cell to the other. So it's a real complex and intricate system that the tendon and other load-bearing tissues have for sensing activity and adaptation. So mechanotransduction is really, really important. What's really interesting about mechanotransduction is, or actually more so adaptation in the tendon, is how it actually occurs. So if you look at adaptation, we know that the tendon responds, it's very mechanosensitive, responds with a lot of protein synthesis, or at least gene expression for many, many different types of loads. Basically, any load you put into the tendon will be a response. But if you want to adapt the tendon and make it stronger, you do need to do specific types of loads to it. And this was a systematic review a few years ago now, and what they showed, there was quite a number of papers in the review. What they showed is that if you want to adapt a tendon, generally you do slow loading or isometric loading that needs to be quite intense. So it needs to be above 70% of your maximal voluntary contraction, or above 70% of 1 RM. That's the type of loading that will lead to adaptation, which is a stronger tendon. More stiffness, as we were talking about before. What was really interesting in this review is that it didn't occur, so adaptation didn't occur if you did plyometric or energy storage type loading. So if you do things like energy storage, which actually has higher loading, I've just told you a few slides ago that the actual loading of the tendon is higher. for energy storage tendons. So why doesn't it lead to adaptation? So here's a comparison of energy storage and hopping. So hopping loading versus maximal isometric plantar flexion. So if you've got someone on a leg press and they did a maximal plantar flexion holding really heavy weight, as much as they possibly could, getting up to maximal for over 5 seconds, it would be 3.6 times body weight load in the Achilles tendon. If you did a hop, just a submaximal hop, just with their body weight, no additional load, they would generate 6 times body weight in their tendon approximately, and they would strain a lot more as well. The actual magnitude of the load doesn't just determine adaptation. There must be another factor, and that other factor is the loading rate. So we know that if you do things quickly, like in a hop, because you're on the ground in a hop for around about 0.2 of a second, if you're on the ground for that short amount of time, it's not long enough, it seems, to bring about adaptation, even though it is a very high amount of load. So there's also a factor for sustained load and time under tension. So it seems to be that time under tension, the magnitude of load, are probably the important combination that we need. And there's probably a really good and interesting reason for this. So if you look at a tendon if you look at a tendon under load, there's various things that happen. There's tensile loading. There's also shearing. So we talked about the fascicles and the subtendons, and they're going to slide. So they're going to create some shearing forces. There's also hydrostatic pressure. So one of the things that I haven't talked about a lot is the fact that you can basically think about tendon as a combination of water and solid. And people call that the fluid phase and the liquid phase, the fluid phase and the solid phase. So that's basically what tendon is, and that's how people model tendon when they model it as a fluid phase and a liquid and a solid phase. But we know that fluid is incompressible. You can't compress fluid. So therefore, you have great hydrostatic pressure when you're loading a tendon, because the tendon stretches and you start to get this squeezing of the fluid, because the tendon, as you stretch the tendon, it becomes thinner in the middle. So you start to get this real squashing. The tendon's incompressible, so it either has to move or get squashed. And as it gets squashed, it creates hydrostatic pressure. As it moves, it creates shear forces. So there's a lot of resistance to actual, I guess maybe resistance is not the right word, because you do get increased strain, but the strain that happens quickly with these hopping contractions is partly taken up by the fluid. So the fluid is there as a protective role. So it tries to protect the tendon from too much loading, in simple terms. And this goes back to the point that I made earlier in one of the earlier slides about the proteoglycans and glycosaminoglycans, and the fact that the energy storage tendons have more of these. So the reason for that is it has a protective function. So water and the fluid phase has a protective function within the tendon, and that is really, really important for injury prevention. Really, really important, and I'll talk about that a little bit over the next couple of slides. So basically, the fluid phase is the proteoglycans, and then the solid phase is the collagen, and they're basically connected. So when you load a tendon slowly, there's time for those bonds to actually break, and then you have the fluid movement. When you load a tendon quickly, there's no time for the bonds to break. It doesn't happen, and you have the tendon fluid contributing to some of the stiffness of the tendon, and that's a really important injury prevention mechanism. And we know this through studies that look at the load rate dependency of tendons. So we know that if you look at different loading rates of tendon, the faster you load a tendon, the stiffer the tendon is. and that indicates that there is this protection against overload when you're doing really fast things. And that's probably a really important mechanism. So possibly you're getting this real shearing force. If you do that in a sustained way, you do lots of running, you're getting this sort of shearing mechanism as you're starting to eventually break these bonds between the fluid and solid phase, and that potentially creates stress that then leads to injury that we see. Okay, so the last point that I want to bring up is just in terms of the fatal vulnerability of Achilles, and that was obviously the fact that his Achilles tendon itself was the only part of his body that was vulnerable. I did see online when I was reading that there is some debate about whether this is actually true, because some of the sort of depictions of his death show that he was actually killed by an arrow in the torso, not in the Achilles tendon, as was shown in the movie Troy. So that was interesting. But basically, what we know now is that Achilles heel, the term, is synonymous with vulnerability. And if you look at Google, I do this regularly as I'm updating my sort of tendon knowledge, and I'll sort of search Achilles heel, Achilles tendon, Achilles tendinopathy on Google Scholar, every few months to see what's come out. And you get a huge amount of studies that basically use it in this way, and that is the vulnerability. So it's interesting to see that it's very strongly within the literature, this vulnerability. So is that actually based on anything? Is Achilles a more vulnerable tendon than the other tendons that we have? And the answer is, unfortunately, yes. So there's this thing called the safety factor with Achilles tendons, and that is when with a safety factor you've got the amount of load that physiologically goes through the tendon divided by the amount of stress or load that it can take. And most safety factors are in the range of about 8. So most tendons can take 8 times more stress than what they generally undergo under normal physiological circumstances. The Achilles tendon is down about 2.6. So you can imagine that's in untrained people, different in trained people. But trained people also take hugely more forces. But you can imagine that what happens is as you get pathology, as you get older, that goes down, and you're really at risk of rupture. That's why we see rupture peaking at about middle age, so around sort of 50, 60 years old for most people. And this was a very old study, but a very seminal and still really current study on looking at a huge number of ruptures, 891 that presented to an outpatient department. And you can see that more than half of them, or almost half of them, were Achilles tendon ruptures. So definitely does contribute to most ruptures that you see. There's definitely something to be said about the vulnerability. So I want to finish there, and I guess the other difference that I want to bring up is that the unfortunate thing about Achilles the Warrior is that we won't know any more than what we already do about him, because there's always digging and excavation going on, but I don't know whether they're going to uncover anything major. But the good news is for us, and also a lot of our research students, that we can still keep on learning more about the Achilles tendon. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.